Good afternoon. It's a big pleasure and an honor to introduce the talk of David Donoho, the winner of the Gauss Prize 2018. David Donoho got his PhD in Harvard in '83, and since 1990, he's professor at Stanford University. He has received numerous prizes and distinctions, and I can't list all of them. Let me just say that he's fellow of SIAM, AMS, IMS. He got the von Neumann Prize of SIAM, the Wiener Prize of AMS and SIAM, and the Shaw Prize in 2013. David Donoho has made deep mathematical contributions that have found significant practical applications outside of mathematics. He's mostly known for his work in statistics and data science. And as Emmanuel Candes said so well in his Laudatio, he's a master in the art of exploiting sparsity in order to increase efficiency. Today, he's going to talk to us and to explain how mathematics can improve our lives and even save our lives by improving the way MRI imaging processing is made. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the very nice introduction. Can everyone hear me? In today's talk, I have help on the slides from a number of people connected with medical imaging, and it's a good time to acknowledge the many contributions that have been made by people besides myself in everything I'm talking about. Mathematics is something that can inspire, and it's something that can help people think clearly, but the real work is done by the engineers, by the doctors, and I'm just in awe of all the contributions they've made that you will see. This is a partial list of the people in the medical sciences and engineering who've contributed, but there's a much larger list, and a set of references for follow-up reading will be posted on my website. I'd also like to apologize. There are a few people in the audience who might have seen an encrypted warm-up talk that I gave about this roughly 6 weeks ago in Belgium. So in case there's some repetitive slides here, I hope you'll bear with me. There's also much that's new to you. I'm going to have a talk within a talk, and the origin of the talk within a talk is an idea by the then director of the Mathematical Sciences Research Institute, David Eisenbud. He wanted to get in front of the US Congress the idea that mathematics makes contributions that the congressmen should be aware of. And so he's had over the years a number of information sessions that have been conducted by the American Mathematical Society, one of the IMU member organizations, and the Mathematical Sciences Research Institute. You see here a picture of David at the blackboard because he chose the title of this lecture, Blackboard to Bedside. And you see a poster that was put together for an information session and congressional briefing that I presented on Capitol Hill in the Senate Russell Office Building about a year ago. As you can see, there was a certain amount of information here that was supposed to entice people to come learn about it, and these included both the science bureaucracy in Washington, congressional staffers, and as it turns out, a few Congress people. So you can read at the AMS website about this briefing, and you can see from the pictures there that the House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi showed up, and the Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer showed up and had interesting things to say. Summarizing the comments that I'm going to make today in the talk within a talk, there's an article in the 2018 January Notices of the American Math Society. So if you want to find out some more details about the specific applications, you can certainly consult this source. And there will be a paper appearing in the proceedings, but it will have more mathematically specific content. So my agenda for today is to talk about what I said in the congressional briefing, because I think it's important for mathematicians to understand how their work gets applied so that they can say something that's relatively mature and accurate rather than to have inaccurate information or shaky arguments. It's better to have good, proven arguments in front of you, and I hope to give you some of those. And then I want to reflect on a specific aspect of this whole experience, which is how did things go from mathematics articles in 2006 to being products on the market in 2017? So at the moment, we're going to dive into the congressional briefing. And in order to denote the part that's a congressional briefing and the part that's specifically to the audience, I'm going to step over here a little bit when I want to get out of character, and then I'm talking to you here today. And when I'm up here, I'm talking to you as if you might be congressmen. And this is very important. We start with a picture of my wife and my son some years ago, and you can see in this picture all sorts of things that will tear at your heartstrings. And the whole point of doing this is that supposedly in Washington there should be some crying at some point in any effective talk. So certainly I'm crying, and my wife, who's in the front row here, is crying. You can see that the young man there is definitely in love with his mother, and you can see the mother's in love with her son, but that's not the reason for the picture. In fact, the reason is that there's a dimple. Can you see a dimple right there? That's the sign that Mickey had brain surgery as a teenager. And our son has always known that she had brain surgery exactly because it's visible on her forehead. And this has had profound effects on how his life has gone. This is a picture 23 years later. He's graduating from medical school, and my wife and I had the privilege to hood him, which is to place the green emblem of medical doctor around his neck. So you see us there in our PhD robes, and we're the proud parents smiling. Later, he became a neurosurgeon, and you see him, recent picture, with his mother, actually in the garden at Emmanuel Condé's and Chiara's house. Next to him is a picture of him and a patient, and the relevance of this picture to you is simply that the patient had the exact same surgery as Dan's mother did. And in fact, if you look, her hairline is a bit mussed up because of the exact same surgical insertion. So you can see the profound impact on his life. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is that applied math, if it's really applied, you should be able to see the effects in your own life. And in this particular case, we really do see the effects. My son has made a number of comments here that you're at liberty to read through or not. The basic point is that MRI is an essential part of modern neurosurgery. It allows surgical planning so that when you open up someone's head and go inside, you know what you're likely to see, and you've planned things out choreographically in minute detail. On the other hand, he's been a surgeon at the LA County Hospital, which basically serves indigent and undocumented individuals. There's a great deal of trauma and a great deal of individual tragedy that he has to see on a daily basis. They are not so well endowed. They have an MRI machine and so on, but it's often backed up. And here's a picture that he texted us. He said, it's the face of today's MRI. What you see there is about 6 surgical staff sitting completely idle, doing nothing, waiting for MRIs to finish. And then you see an itinerary of the MRI, and you can see that it's slated to take an hour and a half. So you have, roughly speaking, 1 person day being wasted of the surgical team's time simply waiting for this procedure to complete. So it would be nice to have MRI in all the cases that they're relevant, but in fact you don't, because it takes so long, because the machine's backed up, and there are other problems that are responsible for insufficient use of MRI. Another place in which you can see the possible impact of improving MRI begins with this picture. This is our son in the center, me on the left, and my father, Dan's grandfather, on the right. In this picture, Dan's graduating from high school, so it's a few years before the last few pictures. We're going out of sequence. The reason we're out of sequence is that my father, Paul, didn't survive until those later pictures. When this picture was taken, he had prostate cancer. I don't think he knew it yet. It was of an aggressive type that was not properly diagnosed. In any event, these were happy times. But because he didn't make it as far as some of those other happy times, I started to learn a bit about prostate cancer, thinking that it might be relevant in my own case, for example. Through that, I met Dr. Faye Stern, who's an advocate for patients and has been trying to develop a program of mass MRI screening for prostate cancer, a so-called manogram. Dr. Stern has been really studying carefully the impact of prostate cancer ever since it affected her own father. Previously, she was highly involved in breast imaging at the NIH in Washington. The main problem with prostate cancer is that despite being a very common cancer, in fact, the most common human cancer, we don't have really very good techniques for identifying the aggressive subtypes. Biopsy, which has been the traditional procedure, is basically a shot in the dark. And it's possible for repeated biopsies to miss time after time, even when aggressive cancer is present. 3D MRI-guided biopsy in clinical trials that have been sponsored by Dr. Stern has a 5 times better chance of detection, but because it uses MRI and the 3D variety, which is more expensive, it's not so commonly practiced. Here's an example that can bring this home. We have pictures of a 53-year-old African-American man, and say the bottom row of pictures, the left is an MRI and the right is a CAT scan. This gentleman had standard blind biopsies every 6 months, 10 biopsies in total. Every single one missed the aggressive prostate cancer. The cancer advanced until the metastases were so bad that they could be seen by the naked eye in X-ray CT, which is extremely rare, but it did happen in this particular case. So time after time of sticking in needles, month after month, and so on and so forth, it was missed. if you had used the appropriate MRI diagnosis early on, the cost would have been far lower than the $600,000 that eventually was spent on this case. It would cost maybe $1,000 for the MRI and maybe $50,000 for early treatment. So in this particular case, there's a human toll and there's a financial toll. And if we could only have better MRI, then there would be certainly better outcomes, perhaps in your family, and certainly could have been in my family. Now, you can see from the last two examples that in our own individual lives, MRI can make a difference in many specific ways that we can enumerate. Traditionally, MRI has been an important and growing technology. There are 80 million MRI scans made in 1 year, and it's certainly growing over time, but it's been held back for a number of reasons, and if it could be made more available, there would be a lot of benefit. In the last calendar year, there have been substantial developments on this front, with new commercial devices having drastically accelerated imaging reaching market. As a result, convenient, more ambitious 3D imaging and dynamic imaging that makes movies are becoming more commercially available than before. So, for example, GE has a product they call HyperSense, and if you go to their website and read about it, they'll explain to you that you can get up to an 8-fold speed up in multi-site applications, namely applications all around the body. In this particular example, the picture A on the left took more than twice as long as the picture B on the right, yet basically equivalent imagery was generated. The technology is able to go much more than a 2x improvement, and the improvement gets better and better as you go to higher dimensions. So if there's a certain benefit in 2 dimensions, it's significantly more in 3, and if you go to 3 plus time, it's significantly more again. Siemens has a product that's directly focused on heart imaging, and you can see here they call their product compressed sensing. Compressed sensing is also the name of a paper that I wrote and that appeared in IEEE Transactions on Information Theory in 2006. So you can see that the commercial manufacturers are quite happy to credit the academics and to even use the terminology that academics first originated. In this particular application, nearly a 16-fold speed up is generated in such a way that you go from something like 6 minutes of data gathering that includes multiple breath holds to 25 seconds of non-breath hold, free breathing data acquisition. That scaling from 6 minutes to 25 seconds makes the particular imaging available to a much wider range of individuals, including very sick cardiac patients. In this particular example, we illustrate what I've just said, and the key point is that the 2 sets of moving images that you see have been judged bioequivalent by FDA procedures. So they're just as good for radiologists, but one was gathered in only about 25 seconds of data, whereas the other one required 6 minutes. And very recently, just in May and June of this year, Philips has gotten approval from the FDA for its own product, and they've tried a different strategy than the other makers. Instead of going after one specific application, they've decided to spread compressed sensing all through their product line, and they've followed an approach of instead of getting dramatic speed ups in some 3D or 3D plus time applications, to try to just get general speed ups everywhere while maintaining image quality. And you can read more about it at their website. So the staff at GE and Siemens were very helpful in talking to me, and for example, Jason Polzin at GE Global Research is quoted here as envisioning that compressed sensing will work its way through the full portfolio of MRI products. Edgar Mueller has said that compressed sensing over time will transform most MRI applications, working basically everywhere, so to speak, from head to toe. So just to step outside for a second, one reason for bringing all of this up, of course, is that healthcare expenses are a major concern of Congress because the US government, through Medicare and through Obamacare and through other particular responsibilities that it has to manage the expenditure of billions of dollars a year in medical imaging. And so this is directly relevant to them, but it's also personally relevant. So we spent the time to remind them of the relevance of this imaging technology before really burrowing into why mathematics could be involved. We'd also like to point out that the developments you're seeing are just simply the beginning of a transformation, and we could point to some ongoing research projects that point to much bigger improvements that are spectacular in their own ways. Shreyas Vasanawala, a radiologist at Lucille Packard Children's Hospital at Stanford, has been one of the leaders in figuring out interesting applications for MRI, often to do with helping fidgety children be imaged who would not otherwise get imaging by MRI modality. Instead of sedating fidgeting young children or irradiating them with X-rays, we can now get imagery that's acceptable even with fairly non-cooperative young people. Here's a particular example of his research interest these days. It's a dynamic cardiac image, but in addition to the moving picture aspect of it, you're actually able to see the fluid flow through arteries and veins. And as a result, you're able to understand very well what exactly is happening in the blood vessels leading to and from the heart. It would have taken more than an hour to gather the data that was used for this under the old regime, but the new regime actually is able to do it in less than 10 minutes. Here's an example of an image of a free-breathing, fidgety young person who couldn't be constrained, yet you're able to clearly see what's going on in the kidneys, despite the fact that they might not be completely cooperative. And this has been used at Lucille Packard Children's Hospital multiple times a day for some years now, and there's a great deal of experience with the success of this. The commercial manufacturers, such as Siemens, are also doing active research, and here's an example of contrasting on the left the non-diagnostic images that have been gathered using the current state-of-the-art CNA MRI with the compressed sensing fast CNA MRI on the right. On the left, you have to get data over 9 heartbeats, and the individual has to hold their breath for those 9 heartbeats, and on the right, you get the data in 1 heartbeat. The image on the right is clear, and it's been judged by radiologists to be diagnostic quality. Here's an example of a 3D cardiac CNA MRI gathered by Siemens engineers and scientists in less than half a minute. It was using a commercially available scanner, and although this particular product is not yet available on the market, it's an example of the things that would be coming soon. In this, you can actually see the individual muscles moving. So the whole point of this presentation is something big is happening in MRI, and then to associate mathematics in the mind of the senators with that. Oops, I guess I should have been standing here while I said that. So whatever I just said, it's from this place. So I wanted to point out that federal support for mathematics, which is about $230 million a year, which in terms of grants that largely fund postdocs and graduate students, and there's some faculty support. It was instrumental in this, and we can point to individual contributors who had had a big impact in this transformation as having been federally funded. So here we have a picture of Emmanuel Condez. Many of you saw him last week on Wednesday. And there's Terry Tao, a 2006 Fields medalist. They collaborated in some of those early papers that are so famous, justly so. They were federally funded at the time, and it's been very important to them to have that support and to be able to work with students like Justin Romberg as they did on their original papers. Well, how is this math anyway? Now, I don't really know that anyone has ever done something like this, tried to relate some real math in some congressional setting. And I don't know that this was successful, but at least I tried. Okay, you see here a plane, and you see a cone. And you see that depending on the particular attitude of the cone relative to the plane might slice into the cone or it might not. And there are some configurations of the plane that have the slicing property and others that don't. What mathematicians know how to do is to calculate the fraction of all the configurations that slice versus those that don't slice. And this is an extension of things in classical mathematics that even congressmen may know about. Let me just explain that at the heart of compressed sensing, one way of thinking about it is that there's something about this slicing property and that connects it to whether we can recover medical images from what would otherwise seem to be very little data. So we state mathematical equivalence between two particular properties, and this is what mathematicians do. They say that certain statements are the same as some other statements. In this particular case, if we're in a million-dimensional space and we consider a very specific simplicial cone that has a 10,000 dimensional apex, we want to know the chance that a random 900,000 dimensional plane slices the cone. And if we calculate with those exact parameters, we will find out that the chance of slicing is very small. This is great because that basic property is equivalent to the following statement. If we're looking for a 1,000 by 1,000 image, and it happens to have only 10,000 non-zero wavelet coefficients, we only need 100,000 measurements, provided they're random in a certain way. So mathematics equips us to answer questions of the first nature, and it equips us to prove their equivalence to things of the second nature. And therefore, mathematics is relevant to showing the way to actually making a reconstruction of a 1,000,000-pixel image, but with only 100,000 measurements. And this is important because you might otherwise think that to reconstruct a 1,000,000-pixel image, you need 1,000,000 measurements, but in fact, in these cases, you don't. And it's at that contrast that we get the leverage that allows us to speed up MRI. So to understand what mathematicians do in making this calculation and why we need mathematicians around, I just want to point out to you a simpler case in which even congressmen can maybe see the answer immediately. In this case, we've got a cone in three-dimensional space, and what we're considering is a one-dimensional plane, namely a line, and there's some attitudes at which the line intersects the cone and some where it doesn't. And if you think about it, it's pretty easy to understand what is the fraction of configurations where the line slices. Because in fact, what it's going to be related to is what fraction of the sphere is inside that spherical triangle. That's a spherical triangle that has the same border as the cone that we've just been looking at, and there's some fraction of the sphere that encompasses. And in fact, Gauss himself was the person who kind of started this whole thing. There's a formula due to him which says that the volume of that triangle is equal to the sum of the internal angles minus 180. And so Gauss saw that maybe this would be important one day. He developed this particular approach to calculation. And actually, what mathematicians would do today in order to understand what's going on in a million-dimensional space is the direct descendant of this, because it's the calculation of a bunch of internal and external angles and an appropriate algebraic cooking them together in order to calculate an appropriate area in some configuration space. So hundreds of years ago, Gauss saw that it was important to go down this road, and mathematicians saw that it was important to develop his insights, and then we had the tools when it was necessary to justify the use of this technology. And in fact, as Edgar Muller here testifies for us, compressed sensing is such an abstract idea that it makes it more general, more applicable. It's not nearly as specific as some other ideas that you might come up with. Another thing to tell Congress is that the research funding system works. We put wonderful mathematics departments like the Stanford math department that's indicated here. It's in a corner of the quad there, and the statistics department is there, and the EE department is there, and the Stanford Hospital that we've been talking. These are all within 100 yards of each other. And Michael Lustig, who was a graduate student in EE at Stanford and really a spark plug in getting all the applications developed and adding many creative ideas of his own, was able to walk out of the EE department, come over to a world-class statistics department, to go to math seminars and a math library that's all sitting there for him, go over and see Shreyas Vasanawala at Lucille Packard's Children's Hospital, and walk 100 yards in the other direction and use a research MRI that was donated by GE. All those facilities are brought together under a system that the federal government has established. And here we see that we're able to deliver the kind of applications that Congress had hoped for. Not only that, but it's not that Stanford is unique in that respect. This is the UCLA campus where Terry Tao is a math professor. There's a math institute there called IPAM, which you can see roughly here, and the math department is right there. In fall of 2004, Emmanuel Condez was at an IPAM program in multiscale geometric analysis and was writing a number of the important papers in this subject together with Terry Tao. So his presence there, the office, and his leave and so on and so forth were handled through federal support, and Justin Romberg's presence there and graduate student support were handled there as well. So we've been able to show that there are benefits for human health coming out of funding of mathematical research, and it's important to recognize the scale of the comparison that we're talking about. There are 40 million MRIs in the US per year at a retail cost of $500 to $1,000 each, let's say. And so we're talking about a top line of, say, $20 billion a year. The research in mathematics, all of it, is about $230 million a year on the federal budget. So not even 1% of the annual expenditures. But the impact that this mathematics could have is far greater than 1%, and it's perpetual. You can read more about this briefing, as I've told you about. There's a little depressing thing here that you may want to look at, that historically the U.S. has been a leader in research support and has been esteemed for its high-minded and far-seeing development of science and so on and so forth. It's important that such efforts continue. It's slightly sad that we have to say that to Congress, but we do. Okay, so now I can step outside. You've heard the congressional briefing part, and you know that I was trying to reach the people there who might be interested in prostate cancer, which are many senators. It's a men's club largely. And I was trying to impress on them that there's some impacts in people's individual lives. But we're here at a mathematics congress, and so I do want to reach out to you as well and make you understand that there is some math here and not only just, assertions of mathematics. So one question you could ask after the briefing that I've just given, which I'm now back in the character of giving a talk to mathematicians, is why did technology transfer happen so quickly? And another would be, why was mathematics in any way helpful? So one way to think about why this happened quickly is that the mathematics was very welcome. Nobody really wants MRI to take longer. There's a very active MRI research community. The people who do MRI expect to be able to deliver improvements year in, year out. And so there's really no obstacles to getting them to consider new ideas if they come along. The key thing is that actually, many people believed that MRI speedups were possible before the mathematics was written down in the way that it's currently written down. There was experimental work where people were getting speedups. However, there were a lot of people who didn't believe other individuals' experimental work. What mathematics gave was clear principles, logical certainty about the derivations of the consequences of those principles, and then heuristics that were easy to communicate, so that the math persuaded and inspired many people, and they could really see that this might work. So as I've said before, one way to understand what compressed sensing is about is through this picture of the incidence relation of planes and cones. It's possible to reformulate that to come up with heuristics that actually can be given to scientists and technologists. They can understand them and apply them correctly. The key thing is to parse out the mathematical statements into clauses that individually express important ideas. So I've done that here with color. And to show how the clauses that are so colored relate to particular aspects that the scientist could understand. And then to try to find counterparts of the mathematical assumptions that the technologists could relate to and could try to design into the processes that they're doing. So in this particular case, the apex of the cone has something to do with how many non-zero wavelet coefficients there are, and the dimensionality of the ambient space has something to do with how many pixels or voxels, and so on and so forth. And so there's some correspondence, and we can make a clear link between the mathematics and things that the scientists and technologists might understand. Out of that, it's possible to construct heuristics that one can then go and speak to the engineers and doctors and convince them that those heuristics truly make this applicable mathematics. So I've taken a slide here that was developed by Michael Lustig and shown, I guess, probably hundreds of times in talks that he gave to the MRI community in the period 2005 to 2010, in which what he did is take the parsing that I just did for you on the previous slide, change the language slightly, and then explain to the community of MRI research what this all meant. He also, in a very savvy way, chose emblems for each of these. So in his telling of the heuristics, there are three components. First of all, it's got to be that you're trying to deal with signals that are in some way compressible. It's that compressibility of the images you're trying to gather that make it possible to compress the sensing. If it weren't true, there would be no compressed sensing. Secondly, the undersampling that you do has to be very carefully done. From the point of view of mathematicians, it's almost ideal if we could in some way undersample by taking random orthogonal projections, uniform in the Grassmann manifold of such objects. But that's not a starter with talking with MRI scientists. And so a language of incoherence and a language of undersampling of K-space was developed in order to reach their understanding. And then a final ingredient is that you have to explain to the scientists that even if the signal is compressible, and even if you undersample, you have to know what you're doing in reconstructing, and you have to use the right kind of algorithm that is in some way nicely matched to the task that we're talking about. In this particular case, the right algorithm is to find the image with the smallest L1 norm of the wavelet coefficients. And it's important to explain that to people as well. So as you see here, Lustig chose, in fact, it's an MRI of his wife. The K-space of his wife's MRI combined with little random dots on it to indicate undersampling. And then a picture of an octahedron to evoke the L1 ball. The point that he made in this particular slide is that a sparse signal is something that corresponds to being localized on one of the hypercrosses, the axes, and that even though you only know that you're in some subspace, an affine subspace, the coral-colored subspace, there's only one sparse point belonging to that. These kinds of devices were very convincing and persuasive. So this is an example of a graphic that he came up with to motivate the task. Here, sparse signals are depicted as things living in those hypercrosses. Of course, these are super sparse signals that just have one non-zero. It's harder to say what it would look like to have, say, 1% non-zeros in a million space. And then the difference between L1 and L2 is evoked through the following. If your undersampling only localizes you to a hyperplane, the minimum L2 point is going to be the point of contact between that sphere, and that's not going to be sparse, but the minimum L1 point is going to be right along one of the hypercross points, and that will be sparse. So the L1 minimization promotes sparsity, not very precise language, but that was useful for promoting understanding. Once you understand those heuristics, it's possible to go back and see why this didn't take over before. In fact, there was a lot of experimentation throughout signal processing over the 30 years prior to the appearance of the math papers that we've been talking about. And you can find work in oil exploration, in interferometry, in astronomy. You can see in NMR spectroscopy, and you can see in electrical engineering, leading up to nearly complete understanding as of the early 2000s. The key point is that because there are three particular ingredients that have to be present, in many cases, the individuals doing the experiments would only articulate one or maybe two of those, and therefore they would be up against a big gap in understanding. You really need all three, and you need to explain all three and show the necessity of the three components that we've spoken about. Here's an example of a thesis by Frank Wadjer in the Netherlands in the early 2000s, in which he had many of the important ideas that later were successful in what you see today, except he was not using convex optimization and he didn't have any theoretical explanation of success. In fact, no one expected that convex optimization would work, because the ideas having to do with cones and geometry and all that were needed in order to justify the convex approach wouldn't have been available in the signal processing community. The reason that computing experiments didn't persuade is that computational research really has some problems, and the biggest one is that people say they got results, but everyone else doesn't know what that means. So you say you got a nice result, you show me some pictures, et cetera, I didn't do it myself, I don't know how to do what you just said, I'm not sure I really believe it. In addition, there's a lot of withholding of data, a lot of non-clearly specified algorithms in papers and so on. So there's a certain amount of cynicism in the empirical research community where researchers don't really believe what other people are telling them. And as a result, empirical research is not as cumulative as it should be, or maybe it's not cumulative at all. In an environment like that, you can make experiments that seem to be productive and showing big progress, and maybe they won't get adopted. The name for this in the world of empirical research these days is the reproducibility crisis, and it has to do with the fact that there's a lot of advertising of successful results that is not entirely believed by other researchers. If you look at math, on the other hand, you say very precisely in a mathematical paper what you're assuming and how you get the results that you get. And you often find very clear limits on what you might possibly achieve. Finally, once you really understand things so clearly, you actually understand things well enough to formulate a heuristic that could be communicated productively to scientists. You're not making it up. You're coming from a place of deeper understanding, and therefore the heuristic is not speculative, but it's grounded. Finally, and this is very important in this particular case, as it turned out, compressed sensing could have been arrived at in many, many different ways. There's not just one way to come to it. The way that I've chosen for this lecture, which uses combinatorial geometry, is only one of the many. I'll show you some of the others in a few moments. The fact that across the mathematical sciences, people found ways to come to the same conclusion about compressed sensing using completely different traditions of argument and mathematical ideation also makes the idea more persuasive. There's one other ingredient which I think I must mention in this particular setting. The ICM awards the Fields medals. What good is that? What good does that do? In this particular case, it's done a lot of good. When a bunch of researchers in the empirical world are arguing among themselves about whether someone's experiments really show something or not, they've reached a standstill. They're in an inconclusive setting. If a team, including Emmanuel Condez, Justin Romberg, and Terry Tao, come and say, oh, there are theorems that can be brought here, and people say, oh, Terry Tao, 2006 Fields medalist. It's a completely different situation. So we have this long tradition of awarding the Fields medals. This is the first time I know of a Fields medal really being put to use almost before it was received. Maybe some of the other Fields medalists will find ways to bring their Fields medals to work for human good, and it would be just great to see that happen. So back to the picture that I showed you before, having to do with combinatorial geometry. I'd like to introduce another graph that's related to this slicing incidence. So on the left, we have what should be thought of as a high-dimensional ambient space, a high-dimensional hyperplane with a significant codimension, and simplicial cone of a particular kind whose details I can't really spell out at the moment. Underlying part of the compressed sensing story, or at least the point of view from combinatorial geometry, is the fact that as you scale up to very high dimensions, so you let the dimension of the ambient space get large, and then you scale up everything else proportionately, the fraction of these configurations of the hyperplane that slice versus don't slice becomes either 1 or 0. And so there's a very particular property that the phase diagram has. If we introduce variables epsilon and delta, where delta is the undersampling fraction, or how, it's how many fewer measurements you're making than there are pixels in the image. So that's here on the x-axis. So as we go to the left on that, we're undersampling more and more. On the vertical axis, we're talking about the sparsity of the object, how many non-zero wavelet coefficients you might have. And we point out that there's a curve in this phase diagram, and on one side of the curve, you have failure because slicing always happens. On the other part of the curve, you have success because slicing basically never happens. That sharp division establishes a limit of what you can actually hope for in compressed sensing, and it provides a reassurance to empirical workers that there is some actual limit somewhere. If the limit is not that you make 1 million measurements for 1 million pixels, they want to know what the limit is, and it's important for mathematicians to be able to say, yes, we have a limit. Well, this is an example of the kind of limits that mathematicians were able to come up with. And then there's this correspondence that I've mentioned before. So the math that we have is related to the applications through this parsing that I've suggested, where there's a dimension of an ambient space, codimension, and so on. And this is just in one take on compressed sensing, where we're talking about the story as it's viewed through combinatorial geometry. On the other hand, there are many takes on compressed sensing that have been developed, and I'll just briefly go over these and just give credit to a few pioneers and mention a few younger people who ought to be mentioned and so on, so that I don't give anyone the mistaken impression that there's only one way or that it's only combinatorial geometry, etc. So I've listed here fields, computational harmonic analysis, very heavily involved in this since the beginning. Combinatorial geometry, which is the backbone of what I've used in this talk, but it's by no means the only way to come at it. Geometric functional analysis, finite dimensional, high dimensional Banach space theory, algorithms in optimization, points of view in mathematical statistics. So I'll just take a few minutes here to mention some of the excellent work and pioneering predecessor work. So a key point here is the sparsity story. And many times in the talk, I've mentioned to you that there's this important fact about real images, that you have sparsity in the right representation. So wavelets came online in say, the mid-'80s, and then were implemented in digital algorithms. It became a standard option for data compression through the '90s, so that by the time many of these developments were happening, mathematicians were very used to the idea that real images often had sparse representations in the wavelet basis. So in this particular case, you see here the wavelet transform of a castle image. You see the various subbands. You see a lot of black, and that black is effectively zero coefficients. And then you see some things that are colored more brightly, which correspond to significantly non-zero coefficients. Some of the contributors who worked in this field, of course, IMU former president Ingrid Daubechies, Yves Meyer, a former Gauss Prize winner, and I've mentioned here just a few more people who should definitely be mentioned in connection with sparsity. And I realize as I'm looking at this that I should have definitely included Rafi Koifman's slide on here. I just can't explain the oversight. Now I'm practically feeling I have to run off the stage. Oh my God. But also Rafi Koifman should be here on this. Combinatorial geometry I've mentioned, and just a few of the key figures. Branko Grunbaum had a paper in the Annals, in the ACTA in 1968 on the concept of what he called Grassmann angles, which is exactly the thing that I've used again and again in this talk. What configuration of hyperplanes slice into a cone? Peter McMullen took the Grunbaum formulas and made them applicable. And then Rolf Schneider and Anatoly Vershik had the ambitious project of actually using them on tasks like the one that I've been talking about. Vershik was the first to really see clearly that in some of these problems you ought to have this failure-success dichotomy. And in his paper with Sporishev, worked out results of this kind related to the simplex, a slightly different problem. And just as an example of the younger generation, there's my collaborator, Jared Tanner. With him, we worked out for the three families of Platonic solids, all these failure and success regions that had been envisioned by Anatoly Vershik years before, using the formulas that we learned from Rolf Schneider and his collaborators. In geometric functional analysis, Gelfand was mentioned in Atiya's talk yesterday. Gelfand defined the n-widths in the Gelfand sense in a Moscow math seminar attended by himself and Kolmogorov and other greats, which had a somewhat different meaning and definition than the Kolmogorov n-widths that are more common. Turned out to be exactly what is needed for this task. And a different way to think about compressed sensing is it's a way to exploit a particular phenomenon exhibited by the Gelfand n-widths. That phenomenon was first uncovered by Boris Kashin in completing a program started by Kolmogorov of computing the epsilon entropy of Sobolev spaces. And in that, Kashin came up with these estimates in the mid-70s that completed that particular program. People working in information-based complexity, such as Joe Traub, Greg Wasilkowski, Henryk Wozniakowski, understood that the Kashin estimates said something profound about signal recovery, and you can see mentions of it in their book. Later, when the compressed sensing story broke, we knew through the work of harmonic analysis and wavelets that it would be very useful to have estimates like Kashin's, but for LP balls not of the L1 type that Kashin studied, but actually for P less than 1. And as an example, you can look up the work of Holger Rauhut and collaborators who worked on that. At about the time the compressed sensing story broke, it became clear that the ability to solve optimization problems like high-dimensional L1 would become very, very useful in ways that were not really envisionable years before. Some of the pioneers in understanding high-dimensional convex optimization included Nemirovsky and Nestorov, who came up with fast ways to solve interior points and to do gradient descent. And just at the time the compressed sensing story broke, Ingrid Dobeschi, Michel de Vries, and Christine de Mol had a paper about solving high-dimensional L1 minimization problems under sparsity, which is exactly what was called for and was very stimulating to have appeared exactly at the moment that it was needed. My longtime collaborator, Ian Johnstone, and I, in the 1990s, we worked on the problem of removing noise from images using wavelets and soft thresholding and a number of related tasks. And as it turns out, we at the time calculated something that we called the minimax mean squared error over various classes of objects. And a specific calculation that we made in those days gave a curve. And we have known this curve for years and years. And I've put here a curve. I don't know if I can't really see very well if I've got it. Okay, so this is the same plot we've been showing all along. And there's a curve in that plot. That curve is the exact curve that Ian and I computed 15 years before for a different purpose with different definitions and completely different meaning application, and would seem to be utterly unrelated. But it is identical. The only thing that's different is in the definition of the underlying variables. And understanding why that could possibly be the case, why this return to some topic that we had been involved in, that was contributed by Andrea Montanari, and in a paper that Andrea and Ariane Malecki and I had, it was actually shown that these phase transitions that were coming out of combinatorial geometry originally were identical to certain curves that had been discovered previously in mathematical statistics, which ushers in a whole bunch of issues in high-dimensional modern statistics, some of which will be explored, I'm sure, in Andrea Montanari's talk tomorrow, and others were already spoken about by Nuruddin El-Karoui in his talk yesterday. And then finally, in information theory, that same equivalence between things happening in combinatorial geometry and things happening in a completely unrelated way having to do with some signal recovery problem with no incomplete data, just reducing noise and so on, has been a theme of research in a collaboration that Andrea Montanari has had with other prime information theorists. And I mention here, for example, Florent Kurzakala and Lenka Zdevorova. as contributors, but there are many others, including some that I just won't have time to do justice to. So I'd just like to finish up here by saying, in this case, math really has gone from blackboard to bedside. Thank you, David Eisenbud, for the title. For the congressman, we have benefits to patients, taxpayers, and physicians, benefits that we can see in our own lives if we're ever called on to justify the expenditures to Congress. And the contribution that math has made here is not that we did all the work. We could never have done that. It's not that we did, everything. No, we simply inspired people. The experimentalists had far better understanding of the physics of designing the MRI sequences and the details of the image processing than we could ever have had. But they, in some sense, needed permission, inspiration, stimulation. And the math did provide that in this case. And that's the kind of benefit that we provide, is an understanding of fundamental algorithms that could be of extreme importance in individual people's lives. Thank you so much for your attention.
Wait. So thank you very much for a very wonderful, exciting, and very convincing talk. We know by now that we can't ask questions to you, but I would like to make a personal comment, and I think that many people will share this comment with me. I've been several times in an MRI machine, and it was really like a torture to be there for a long time, not breathing. And this talk excited me very much and made me hopeful, because next time I will have to go into the machine, it will be quicker and much nicer. So thank you very much for this wonderful work. Thank you.